Welcome back for week 2 tutorials in using R in data analysis. Last week we talked about, among other things, objects. In particular, we talked about vectors and we talked about data frames. And so in this next set of tutorials, I'm going to talk about using vectors and data frames in a little bit more detail, specifically talking about selecting elements within vectors or data frames. And then the reason to talk about that is so that if we wanted to manipulate, change, or edit our vectors or data frames, we could do that with those specified elements. So the first tutorial is going to be about selecting elements in objects, and then the second tutorial is going to talk about manipulating data. And hopefully these will be relatively quick tutorials. So, selecting data. The first thing we can do is we can select specific values if we know that there's a specific value we want. And we can do this in vectors or data frames. We'll start with vectors. And the idea behind selecting any sort of value is that we have to index it, or we have to know what specific place it has in that object. So we can use brackets to specify a particular location within a vector. If we just have one number, for example, we just want to pick out object number 4, we can just pick in one number over here to our brackets. If we want to pick several elements within a vector, we can use our C function over here and then specify a little mini vector to specify all the numbers of the elements that we want to select. So, for example, if you remember our vector last week, our vector y with 2, 0, 1, and 9, it has 4 elements in it. Let's suppose we want the fourth one. If we say y bracket 4, that picks the fourth element, which is the number 9. All right? And if we want to, we can store that in a vector itself. We can say y4, and we can make it a vector with the number 9. We could do the same thing with our vector bases from last week. So remember, bases had the elements A, T, G, and C in it. So let's suppose that we just want to select the G and the C. So we could do that. Here's our vector bases, brackets. Our little C function over here specifies multiple values we're going to select, the third and the fourth one. We're going to store it in the vector GC, which will now have the elements G and C in it. I think that's fairly straightforward, so try these practice problems, and I'll be back in a minute. All right. What I've done to speed things up is I've already created the initial vectors, y and bases. So let's take a look at the practice problems. So using the vector bases, create a vector with just t. So here's our vector bases. Brackets for a subset, and we just want t, which is the second element, so we can do it like that. All right, and that gives us a t. All right, using bases, create a vector with a and g. All right, so bases, again, the brackets for a subset, but now we can't just put in numbers here because we have multiple numbers, so we have to also express these as a vector itself inside the brackets, and we wanted the A, which is the first one, and the G, which is the third one. There we go. We run that line. There we go. That gives us the bases A and G. And finally, we're going to use the vector Y, and we want the numbers 2, 0, and 1, which is the first, the second, and the third position. So we could do it like this. We have a series of numbers, so a series of index values, so 1, 2, and 3. That should work. All right. Or if we wanted to speed things up a little bit, we could say y brackets, and if you remember from last week, if we use a colon, that specifies all numbers continuously. So 1 colon 3 gives us the numbers 1, 2, and 3. We're not using commas, so we don't have to use the combine function, and that gives us the numbers again, 2, 0, and 1. All right. So let's go from indexing vectors to indexing data frames. And data frames aren't one-dimensional like vectors are, they're two-dimensional. In other words, they have rows and they have columns. So it gets a little bit more complicated to index vectors, index data frames in 2 dimensions. But here are a set of rules. So if we use our brackets and only put in one set of numbers or names, and those numbers or names indicate that columns are specified. For example, if we have the name of a data frame, brackets for subset, C for combine, and we give a series of numbers. Those will be interpreted as column numbers. Similarly, if we give a set of names in our bracket, these are assumed to be column names. All right, but now let's suppose we want to pick out specific rows and specific columns. We need to give two sets of numbers, and those two sets of numbers need to be separated by a comma. And the first set of values is always rows, and the second set of values is always columns. So we have frame name here, brackets indicate a subset, C, this is to create our vector of row numbers, comma, C, another little vector of column numbers. Or if we want to sort of do a hybrid of these two methods, we could put in a set of column numbers followed by, comma, a set of column names. Sorry, I said row numbers followed by a set of column names. Finally, let's suppose we want to select either all rows or all columns. We can do that simply by leaving a blank in the appropriate place relative to our comma. So let's suppose we want to select a specific set of row numbers. We specify these here and for the comma, but then if we leave this blank after the comma, that simply tells R that we want all the columns. We don't care about selecting specific columns. All right, hopefully these examples will illustrate this. So let's go to data frame 1 that we created last week, if you remember. And so this is going to have three columns. The first is diameter with 3 values. The second is predation, again with 3 values, yes, no, yes. And finally height with 3 values again. So the first thing we can do is specify columns. So in frame 1, let's just specify 2 columns, the diameter column and the predation column. We do that with our combine function, the name diameter, comma, the name predation. There we go. Or we can do the same thing, but instead of using names, we use column numbers, 1 and 2, or because this is a continuous set, we can just say 1:2, and that will give us everything from 1 to 2. All right. So the latter would be the easiest way, but the top way is probably the way that will make the most sense as you're going back and reading the code. Okay, let's suppose now we want to specify rows and columns. So again, in data frame 1, we could use our brackets right here. If we just wanted to select one row, say row number 1, we put in a 1 there. If we wanted to select 2 columns, say the first and the second, we could specify that after our comma. So it returns row 1, columns 1 and 2. And finally, if we wanted to specify all columns, what we could do is we could specify, say, a particular set of rows. In this case, let's suppose 1 and 3, comma, and then we leave a blank right here, which tells R that we want all columns. If you want, give these examples, these practice examples a try. If you're comfortable with them, let's move on to the practice problems. All right. Okay, and here are the solutions. So again, I've created these data frames in advance. So I'll come over here to my practice section. And the first one is we want to use frame 1 and specify all rows. Frame 1, all rows are in the height column. So one way to do it, the formal way to do it, might be to just use brackets and give the column name over here. And we could say height. And that should do it. Yep, there we go. If we wanted to do it with a number instead of a name, we could do it like this. And the height is the third column, so there we go. Same thing. Using this, since we just have one number, we wouldn't technically have to use a little vector combine function like that. We could say that, and again that specifies the third column. All this is giving us exactly the same thing. Or finally, if you remember from last week, and this is probably the easiest way to do it, we could just sort of skip the bracket notation since we only want a single column and just specify frame 1, $, and the name of the column. All right, all that does the same thing. Okay, on to the second problem. So using frame 1 again, let's specify all rows in the predation and the height columns. Frame 1, brackets the subset. So we're using all rows. We don't have to put in a value for rows, but we want the predation and the height column, so we need to specify those, and we can do it by name, predation, and height. There we go. That should do it. Again, if we wanted to shorten this a little bit, we could use numbers instead of a name. And predation is 2, and height is 3. So we could do it like this. Or finally, hopefully you're getting the hang of this. Since 2 and 3 are consecutive, we could just do it like that. 2:3. Oops. Okay. Very good. That's the second problem. Problem number 3, using frame 1, let's now specify just row 2 of the predation and the height columns. So I'll take our first line up here and copy it, paste it. But now we want row 2, so we could say row 2, comma, and then specify the columns that we wanted. There we go. That does it. And question number 4, using frame 1, specify rows with Y in the predation column and all columns. All right. So frame 1, what rows do we want? Those with Y, and if you remember, those are rows 1 and 3. So let's specify rows 1 and 3 here. And then we want all columns. We can simply say comma, and then we can leave a blank there for all columns. And we run that, and we get our 2 rows, 1 and 3, with all 3 columns. All right, and hopefully at this point you're also getting the idea that there can be several different ways to tackle problems in R once you know the syntax, and all of these ways work just fine. So in these last examples, we selected specific indexed values. But let's suppose that we don't know precisely what rows or what columns we want. And more often this is the case with rows. Suppose we want to select rows based on a specific criteria, but we don't know the actual row numbers. All right, so let's suppose, for example, we want to select all plants with a height greater than 2. And if we had a data set that was very large, this might be difficult to scroll through the whole data set and figure out what those are. So we can use our bracket again to specify a set of parameters now instead of a specific set of row numbers. So frame 1, our brackets again, but now instead of specifying particular row numbers here, we can simply say frame 1 $height, meaning column height, is greater than 2. That's our criterion, and then we want all columns that meet this for these rows that we have selected. And notice in particular that we have to put in the frame 1 here, and I know this seems a bit redundant since we just said frame 1 over here, but in fact we could set up a set of criteria that were actually outside of the data frame over here, so that's why we have to specify the data frame and the column name in our brackets. Okay. This is the way that we do it using brackets. We can also use the subset function, and if you've taken Math 111 and you're familiar with the subset function, excellent, and if you want to prefer it, if you prefer using the subset, that's just fine. So the subset function can take 3 arguments. It can take the data frame name, it can take secondly, the rows to be selected, that's where we put in our criteria, and finally the columns that we want to select. And again, we can put in a set of criteria. We can specify particular columns, or if we just leave this blank, it'll give us all columns. So subset over here, frame 1 tells us data frame 1. Now we can just use the name of the columns. We specified frame 1, height is greater than 2, and in this case we might want all columns, so let's say 1 to 3. Okay, a shorter way of doing that would be frame 1, height greater than 2 as we did before, but just not specify the columns since there's only 3 columns. All right, So try these practice problems over here. Oops, and this should be diameter greater than 20. All right, back in a minute. All right, let's take a look at these two practice problems. We want to select rows in which the diameter is greater than 20. Frame 1. We can use the subset brackets. Need to say frame 1 again, $, diameter is greater than 20, and if we want all rows, we put in a comma and we leave a blank, and that should do it. Oops. Let's spell diameter correctly. There we go, and we get one row with a diameter that was greater than 20 and all three columns. We could also use the subset function. We could say frame 1. Now we can just say diameter over here for our column is greater than 20, and we don't need anything else, and we should get the same thing as we did above, exactly. All right, problem number 2 in our little practice set, select rows in which there was predation. All right, so predation is indicated by Y, so we can say frame 1, brackets, frame 1, $. This time we need to specify the column predation. We need to use a double equal sign for is equivalent to, put in a Y. All right, and we need to include only the diameter and the height columns. So let's say C, a vector now with column names, diameter, and height. There we go, the diameter and the height columns. And notice that these were the two yes values for predation. And again, if we wanted to, you could use the subset function, and I'll let you do that on your own. Hopefully at this point, you're getting the hang of the subset function. So our set of key skills for this tutorial has been, first, create a subset of data from a vector using the bracket notation. Then create a subset of data from a data frame using the bracket notation. Do the same thing from a data frame, but instead of using the bracket notation, use the subset function. And finally, select rows in a data frame that meet a particular set of criteria, and you can use either the brackets or the subset for this particular skill. All right, very good. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching this tutorial.